response to the U.S. I'm sorry. China's response to the U.S. is basically you can't even govern your own country. You can't even agree on stuff internally. How are you going to tell us what to do? And I think what we're seeing now with the negotiations on the infrastructure package and the stimulus programs going forward, real questions are raising about how are we governing as a nation and where do we go from here. So today I want to talk about deal or no deal and what happens with the proposal. What does it mean for the broader agenda? So really want to touch on these three topics. Does the deal go through as a bipartisan deal? Does it get tied to reconciliation? What about the rest of the Democratic agenda and who's driving the bus? I think are some of the key questions here. I'd add another one, which is even if they agree on stuff, can they get it spent and done in an effective way? But we'll leave that out for now because that's too cynical. So they came out with a proposal that would spend basically 1.2 trillion over 8 years. There would be 66 billion for rail, which we desperately need, 49 billion for public transit, including money for charging stations, 909 billion for roads and bridges. And just to give you a sense, the bridges, we have about 620,000 bridges. 1 in 9 are structurally deficient today in the US. We have a real problem there. We know about the water problem and the sewage and power and environmental remediations. Broadband is another big push. And then they want to put a down payment on resilience projects, such as upgrades to coastal infrastructure. So that would be levees and the like in New Orleans. It would be how do we protect the New York Harbor from another big storm, things like that, or how do you get resilient? They're looking at a cost of, I think, $10 billion to put up some barriers in the New York Harbor to protect the lower Manhattan area. They also want to focus on better enforcement, investment in the IRS to close the tax gap. They think they can raise close to $1 trillion over 10 years by doing that. So what's not in the plan? All the human infrastructure initiatives that the progressives had been pushing for, no funding in any significant way for affordable housing, and no new taxes on the wealthier corporations. That's in the bipartisan bill. So where do we go from here? It really depends on the Joes, and that's Biden and Manchin where we go, because from President Biden's case, he agreed to a deal, bipartisan deal, seemed to back away from the deal and then reinforced that he wasn't backing away from the deal because he wasn't going to tie it to the reconciliation or the rest of the Democratic agenda. He did tell Republicans from the very start that he was going to push through that agenda whatever way he can. So the fact that he accepts a bipartisan bill and doesn't tie it, doesn't limit or reverse whether he's backing out on an original agreement. I think it's unclear what Joe Manchin wants, other than for Washington to maybe operate the way it's supposed to. But it's hard to define what would be a win for the Democratic moderates because they have no reason to declare at this point because it gives them even greater leverage. So I think this is going to be a really fascinating thing to see is within the parties, who do they get behind and what are they supporting and what do they really stand for? And this gets into what's the role of the progressives in the Democratic Party and what's the role of the moderates and the president, where does he stand? President Biden's been very clear he wants the full boat, but he's also a Washington politician. So something really interesting. And then the other question is, how hard do the progressives fight the president and the moderates to achieve their goals? What's it going to take to pull the party together to a platform that they can agree on to position themselves against the Republicans, because we have a midterm election not too far away from where we are right now. So this is a critical time for the negotiations and how things move forward. So what are our thoughts? Republicans have the luxury of negotiating, knowing that it doesn't matter what they do, because the Democrats can try and push things through without bipartisan support, but they have a razor-thin margin. And that's where the moderates in the Democratic Party really have a lot of power here. President Biden knows the Washington and how it works and has promised to work across the aisle, but how does that play out when his own party is not supporting him working across the aisle, depending on the role of the progressives? And then, he's going to really have to use all his skills to get as much of his agenda approved. And it's not likely that they're going to get much of it, as much as they would have liked. But it's hard to tell when he put a $6 trillion proposal out, how much of that was negotiating versus how much of that did he really think was necessary to get done or to appease the interest group. So we think that the likely outcome will be Republicans will give in they're going to end up with tax increases and higher spending than they had planned, whether they give into it or not, or it's done around them. They're going to be tax increases, not likely as high as they originally proposed. So we would probably expect capital gains to be more in the 28% range, corporate taxes to be more in the 25% range. And there will be some increased taxes on individuals when all is said and done. But the Democrats are going to get a lot less than they wanted, particularly the progressives, on how they get there until the midterms. And the midterms will determine who really has the hand or the leverage to move forward. So we think this is generally not as negative for the markets as people might think it would be, because the fears of a full out progressive agenda don't seem as likely right now. But a lot of that will depend on which way the moderates go. And just to be clear, for this to get through, even the bipartisan program, they can't lose any Republicans. And for any Democrats that aren't going to support this, that are already in, they're going to need another person to step up. And it's not clear really how this is going to play out, other than stuff is going to get done because we need to make some spending on infrastructure. We probably need slightly higher taxes. The Trump administration probably went too far on lowering the corporate tax rate. 25% would have been an appropriate level in the past. And we went down below the average for OECD nations. And I also think it's going to be difficult still with the G20 meeting coming up to get the global tax put through, which is a big element of getting this whole program put through. So nothing easy coming in terms of what's coming out of DC and where we go from here. Mark, I'll stop it there and then we can open it up to questions or conversation.
All right. That was short and sweet. So what questions do we have? Or comments?
Stephen, this is Luke. Question about the rail part. I've been tracking some of this in some other areas. I'm wondering if most of that rail that's being proposed, or most of the high-speed rail projects and the infrastructure for, more public transportation. But from what I was reading up on, most of those proposed projects, none of those companies are like GE. They're all more, I think, China-based companies for the cars in those projects.
Well, you have that element. The other part of the rail system is we have parts in the Amtrak corridor going up to the Northeast where the train has to slow down to 20 miles an hour. So you're defeating the whole purpose of the speed that you can get there. So a lot of this is on things like getting the tracks in good order, getting a new tunnel from the city to New Jersey, things like that are longstanding projects that will ease the congestion in a lot of areas. Some of it is to get high speed, but we're light years away from doing what China did. So I think when you look at the proposals, a lot of it gets watered down, and there aren't going to be as many easy, significant investment opportunities coming out of this as you might think in other proposals.
What's the effect going to be on some of the competition? Air, those guys, like they do this, I'm a big rail guy, I take a train all the time, right? So much easier, faster, better than flying, especially short distances. What's the effect on air travel and the air companies and the airlines, the airports?
I have separate issues. I think the air system needs improvement, as we see with LaGuardia's airport undergoing massive improvements to improve efficiency. And that gets to a lot of the waste, right? So when you upgrade the systems, you allow for less waste in the overall system. So I think that's a key element of what they're trying to improve. So I think all areas for infrastructure are overspent. And the other thing to keep in mind, the American Society of Civil Engineers report is projecting out just to keep our system in a state of good repairs means we have to spend 5.9 trillion over the next 5 years. So we're coming in way short of what our actual spend is required. But we do have corporations and state and local governments paying into this, not just the federal. But I think keeping in a state of good repair is a far cry from building high-speed rails. So it's really to protect us from having more serious incidents like bridges collapsing or water systems, killing people because the water's, contaminated. So we're not talking about changing the way our economy works with this level of spend.
I have a follow-up question on
Zale, sorry, just let's move it around if you don't mind. John, quick question.
Yeah, a quick question. Do we have the skilled labor to deliver this 1 trillion in infrastructure? And is there any part of this bill that actually invests in people reskilling or upskilling?
The first question is, we have the people. The question is, do they want to do it? Or are they getting paid to not work? Or are they going to look for other opportunities that might be beyond a program like infrastructure spend? So it really just depends on that. We have the skills. And with the right immigration policy, we could assure the skills.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments?
Zale, you had a follow-up?
Yeah, it's totally, this is more on some of your other expertise. What's the impact of another $1 trillion going to have on inflation? I was listening to a podcast on S&P Global with a bunch of economists, and we have a $1 trillion that was just spent, with the COVID stuff, and now we're going to have this other $1 trillion. Looks like we're going to go, is this not going to really affect inflation in a big way? And lack of resources and lack of everything.
In theory, you should have less inflation after the improvements because you should be more efficient if we spend the money right. But the question is, are they going to spend it right? The federal government's great for financing. They're not as good for executing. So that's going to be state and local, and corporations are going to do the execution of it if they do it right. But it really depends on, is it a productive spend or not when all's said and done? And if you water it down too much, it might not be.